another edition of World Talks here on TVP World, where every word matters. I'm your host, Benjamin Lee. Please join me and my guest on this next interview. Now, recent reports reveal that Russia has been secretly building war drones in China. Meanwhile, Beijing has conducted a rare test firing of an intercontinental ballistic missile, raising concerns about its growing military capabilities. These developments come amidst a complex geopolitical landscape involving Russia, China, and their relations with Western powers. Joining us today on TVP World to provide insights into these unfolding events is Saran Singh, professor at Jawaharlal Nehru University. Sir, and welcome to TVP World.
Thank you.
So can you help us understand what are the implications of Russia building war drones in China for the ongoing conflict in Ukraine and this global security situation?
I think more than the actual facts that are still contested, I think the context is much more significant. Because recently only President Putin had publicly said that the drone production of Russia is going to be increased for next year by about 10 times, taking it to 1.4 million drones to be produced by Russia. Now, in that backdrop, and of course the backdrop of no limit partnership of China and Russia, this news about Russia outsourcing production of drones to China. In fact, one of the news agencies is saying that 7 of these, in which 2 are particularly the ones which are under discussion, have already been supplied to Russia. It becomes, I think, matter of concern, and concerns are expressed accordingly by United States and of course by Ukraine. So the context, I think, is more critical to understand what could be its implications. And then, of course, it gets linked to the fact that China itself also this Wednesday conducted its first test of a missile, intercontinental missile called the Tongfang 41. The last test of such missiles had happened about 44 years ago in May of 1980. So now that test and the warheads landing exactly at the space they were supposed to, collectively, I think, make the anxiety a little more, much more serious in that sense of how the world is responding, especially the Ukraine and the supporters of Ukraine are responding to the possibility of China, breaching the red line of its neutrality on Ukraine crisis and supplying lethal weapons. Of course, so far we know that Chinese have been supplying what is called dual use or components which could potentially be used in weapon systems. Of course, China continues to deny that. So they are not owning up to providing any military support to Russia, other than, of course, importing energy from Russia, which also indirectly helps Russia to continue with its war in face of enormous sanctions by Western countries. So I think collectively the context, I think, is more significant. But of course, at base of it, it's a right of 2 sovereign states, of China and Russia, as to how they wish to conduct their mutual partnership in terms of defense cooperation and so on. But it does send a trend because, in long term, US sees China as a more serious systemic challenge. And if we see how Chinese GDP in last 30 years has gone up from about 300 billion to nearly 20 trillion economy, which means more budget allocations to everything else, from university education to sports to, of course, military modernization, which has also created concerns in United States. Various reports saying how by 2030 Chinese nuclear arsenal could actually be as bigger as the United States and Russia. Now those circumstances in which these news are being discussed is perhaps what makes it far more kind of scary and potentially disruptive in that sense. And I think that is why one has to really take into note what are actual facts. Because facts, as I said, are constantly contested. China has one view, United States has a very completely different view.
Right, you mentioned a lot of very important topics here. Like you said, Russia is planning on 10 times its drone production to 1.4 million. With the no limit partnership with China, it's really hard not to put two and two together to come to the conclusion, yeah, perhaps some of the drones are being produced in China. Adding to the fact, again, like you mentioned, these dual-use goods being seen used for military purposes. My question would be, at this point, why is Beijing still trying to deny its involvement in the war? Are they for fearing Western pushback? Is it for internal consumption to pretend to have the moral high ground? Is it a message to the global South? What's the intention behind these messaging?
I think in the end you touched the most relevant factor behind it, or the force behind it. Imagination of China and global acceptance of what China does. So the question of legitimacy is very significant, whether it is how the global South sees it or how the other emerging powers see China's behavior when it professes to sustain neutrality on this Ukraine crisis conflict, and whether then it would be seen in terms of siding with Russia, which most American media believes that China is already siding with Russia. And they have actually been insinuating that China has been supplying military materials to Russia already. Of course, so far as we are saying, in terms of dual use or components of various potentially weapon systems. So therefore, I think there are those ideational and far more invisible issues that are much more effective than sanctions. Sanctions, of course, would also be a matter of concern for China, but China has faced sanctions before. It's not the first time. So sanctions would be a matter of concern, but I think much more will be these intangibles of how world sees China emerging as a great player, and what will be seen its role, whether it is trying to project itself as a peacemaker, or is it also, like the Western nations, supporting the other side, which is Russia, to also continuously push for war being the solution, which is how West has been proposing. West is approaching Ukraine crisis fundamentally in terms of strengthening Ukraine to fight much more rigorously, rather than focusing much more on how peace can be brought about at the earliest. So then Chinese would be seen likewise supporting a war effort rather than peace effort, which again is something Chinese do not want to do. Chinese want to project China as a peacemaker rather than as a country which is seen as a warmonger.
Right, so there's definitely a different target audience here. You just also mentioned something important about the implications of what it means that China is building these drones. Well, for Russia is perhaps more crucial than the drones in and of itself, especially adding to the fact that these intercontinental ballistic missile testing with the capability of carrying nuclear warheads. Do you think all these calculations will accumulate to a different geopolitical balance and different way that the West treats countries like China and Russia going forward? Are we at a pivotal point where international relations might be turning?
I think that has been something in the making, and each time a nudge is given to further make China as a global player. Of course, China has tried to primarily use its economic prowess in building trade and partnerships of all kinds, particularly very often one-sided investments into almost 150 nation states, which has collectively meant about $1.5 trillion under Belt and Road Initiative. But of course, its military prowess also has been enhancing over a period of time. And I think maximum estimates talk about China having about 300 ballistic missiles. Tongfeng 31, Tongfeng 41 are seen as the most potent intercontinental ballistic missiles. And in that sense, test of an intercontinental ballistic missile, particularly demonstrating its circular error probability being far more accurate than it was in 1980s when last tests were done, also in Western Pacific, of course, is a message clearly to whoever sees himself or herself as adversary to China. And of course, message in that sense is very clearly to United States in terms of China's capability to reach out to all possible targets on mainland United States and of course on Hawaii Islands as well. Now these are more or less symbolic gestures in that sense of power projection, which I think is part of China rising as a global player, where the primary focus, of course, remains on wielding political influence, building economic partnership. But when country grows economically powerful, it has more resources to also deploy much more resources for its defense. And I think this is part of that exercise of the overall rise of China, in which military power projections is just an integral part of it. Of course, since United States sees China not only having intention but now also having capabilities to replace United States leadership to begin with in the Asia Pacific, of course they will be the most vulnerable and then perhaps most concerned about China demonstrating these capabilities rather than just building these capabilities. So message very clearly is for United States, but whether it has to be seen in the context of China-Russia coming closer and therefore a whole kind of a new Cold War emerging between the United States on one side, followed by Russia and China being collectively on the other side, that kind of anxiety, I think, is also likely to be triggered from such multiple news arriving simultaneously in terms of brandishing of nuclear threats from Moscow, estimates of increasing drone production 10 times, and revision of nuclear doctrine this Wednesday in Moscow, and China, of course, doing this intercontinental ballistic missile test. So when all these things happen simultaneously in a same day or in same week, that perhaps does raise anxieties in countries that think they have to be worried about emerging capabilities of China and Russia, and of course their increasingly cohesive and no limits partnership that they have been building since last 2 years now.
Right, like I mentioned, all these things coming together in the timing that could probably not be coincidental, and we'll have to wait and see whether or not this triggers a shift in the global arms race. Meanwhile, thank you so much for your input and insight. Really appreciate it, and thanks again for being with us on TVP World. And thank you for watching this edition of World